Haven't heard. Could be a little bit late.
Okay, well, I will call the meeting to order. It's just about 7 o'clock by my watch. We do have 3 sets of minutes to review tonight. We do have a quorum to review, all of the minutes. So we'll start with May 9th, 2017. Is there a motion to approve?
I move to approve the minutes dated
May 9th.
May 9th, I'm sorry, with amendments there too.
Is there a second?
Second.
Page 1. Page 2. Page 3. You have one minor typo under the third bullet on public comments. The second line, it talks about $10,000 covers dredging of a 4-bay pond. That's supposed to be F-O-R-E, bay, one word. The only reason I know that is because it was reflected in the consultant's report.
Well done.
Page 4.
So on page 4, I think the discussion, there was discussion, I think I mentioned that Terry Zitrich suggested that 2% plus service fees are excessive for the use of town ratepayers' money. And I asked, and Terry Zitrich asked Jennifer Kennelly, who answered that the town receives less than 1% on savings, just to get an idea of what we would be losing for that.
So under which part are you talking about on page 4?
That was in the discussion part, just before the motion.
Before the
I think
full-
Ted offered a compromise motion.
So you'd like to have it reflected in the minutes?
If you would, yep.
Anything else on page 4? Page 5. Hearing no other amendments or corrections, all those in favor of approving the minutes of May 9th, 2017, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? Any abstentions? None. Okay. Now we're on the May 16th, 2017 minutes, and Joy was absent on this meeting. Is there a motion?
Move we accept the minutes subject to modification.
Is there a second?
Second.
Page 1. Page 2. And page 3. So hearing no corrections, all those in favor of approving the minutes of May 16, 2017, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? And one abstention, Joy. And we have the minutes of May 25th, and Teresa was absent on this. Is there a motion to approve?
Move we approve subject to modification.
Second.
We have one page 1. Hearing no corrections, all those in favor of approving the minutes of May 25th, 2017, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? And one abstention, Teresa, I presume. And we're into public comment. Anyone in the audience who wishes to make a public comment on any issue, either on the agenda or not on the agenda, this is your time to do so. And seeing no hands raised, we'll move on to board interviews and appointments. What we have before us tonight is a list of people in various positions on town boards and commissions that are willing to stand for reappointment. I would call to your attention one minor detail, in the forest fire warden will be taken up under number 5, so we would not want to approve that position in a motion that might be made. So with that introduction, is there, and I would propose to you that a motion might be made that doesn't use the word boards, but town positions instead, if you're so inclined.
I move to reappoint the individuals currently serving on town
Positions?
positions, with the exception of the fire warden, to another term as indicated on the spreadsheet dated May 2nd, 2017.
Second.
For discussion on the motion. Hearing none, all those in favor of the motion say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? No abstentions?
If I might, just one quick
Yes.
comment.
Sure.
This, every single person whose term was expiring has agreed to continue, which is just
Yeah,
amazing.
amazing.
That is
Yeah.
We
amazing.
do have one resignation, but that person's term wasn't expiring.
They moved, right, or they're moving?
Yes, they-
Yeah.
Rick, would it be possible to get a list of all the current committee members?
Sure.
That would just be helpful to me.
All commissions and boards?
Yeah, just,
Sure.
because I forget over time, and it would just be, thank you.
So let's move on to item number 5, and that's the fire warden appointment. And so Rick sent us a memo regarding this, and the request is to reappoint or appoint a town forest fire warden. Ken Morton has agreed that he would wish to do this again for a term of 5 years, and there is a proposed motion for that.
I move to appoint Ken Morton as the town forest fire warden for a 5-year term starting July 1st, 2017.
Second.
So any discussion on the motion? Hearing none, all those in favor of the motion say aye. Aye. Any opposed? And no abstention?
I have a document that needs to be signed. Okay. You get a chance.
So I'll start this passing that down. Next is the health officer and deputy health officer appointment, and I did send you an email in response to questions from Jeff regarding the appointments. As I said in the email, that I've been a health officer for 27 years, and probably was deputy, I think, for a year or 2 or 3 before that. Over the course of the last number of years, we've been seeking a deputy health officer that would be interested in serving as health officer when the time came for me to step down, and that's happened. Cindy Thurston, who was appointed as deputy health officer about 3 years ago, has agreed to be the health officer, and with a proviso that I would be her deputy to bring some expertise and experience to the position. So I have agreed to do that if the board wishes to make those motions to the effect of, make the effective positions for health officer and deputy health officer.
Okay. I move to recommend for appointment Cindy Thurston as the town's health officer for a 3-year term starting July 1st, 2017.
Second.
Is there any discussion on the motion?
So I just wanted to go quickly over, I was a little bit, I sent out the questions because I was just a little bit concerned and wanted to make sure I was comfortable. But the email that Terry provided, her qualifications being a nurse, training under Terry's wing, if you will, I think satisfied those concerns, if you will, if not more than satisfied.
She's very well prepared, and as I mentioned in the email, she has taken upon herself to do some of the investigations that was requested of her in my absence, so it's worked out
Okay.
very well.
And I think the thing with the health officer too is that I don't think you're called out all that often, but when you're called out, it can be pretty intense.
Can be.
And, so,
Any further discussion on that motion? If not, all those in favor of the motion say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? No abstentions? There should be a second motion,
I
perhaps?
move to recommend for appointment Terry McCaig as the town deputy health officer for a three-year period starting July 1, 2017.
Second.
Is there any discussion on the motion?
Yeah, just an anecdote. I recall going out with you as a select board representative, and you were the town health officer and select board representative when we investigated a case of a off-duty police dog biting an off-duty deputy state's attorney. You were like Columbo. So it's based on that experience that I'm going to vote in favor of the motion.
Is there any further discussion on the motion?
oh, I'm sorry, how many years was it? Did you say 20?
27?
That should be recognized.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yep, thank you.
So all in favor of the motion say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed, say no. There's no abstentions. So let's move on then to the neighborhood stormwater grant policy. And I believe that James Sherrard, our stormwater coordinator, who is going to be here to talk about that. Jennifer Canelli, who's able to answer questions regarding monies with us tonight for both this and the next item. So who would like to start on this? James, I know you wrote a memo to Rick regarding this issue.
I did. I'm happy to summarize that if you'd like.
Sure.
Essentially, the challenge with obtaining grants is the need to distribute it equitably throughout all the participating neighborhoods, while only perhaps applying for one individual neighborhood for a grant. So the document we put together and what we're trying to do here is figure out the methodology of distributing those funds. If we get $100,000, who gets what percent of that? So what my memo does is provide 4 different options, and these 4 different options have come through a variety of, well, a number of iterations, but one of the first steps was town staff, myself, meeting with stormwater representatives from each neighborhood that was interested in this process, and that birthed the idea that we could perhaps tie it to certain metrics, and what staff believes are a variety of metrics for consideration are here. To touch upon them each briefly, treated impervious surface. This metric is trying to recognize within each neighborhood how much impervious cover their stormwater systems will treat. The nice part about this is that it's a direct nexus to the problem. Allenbrook is impaired because of stormwater runoff. Runoff is generated from impervious surfaces. When we capture and treat those impervious surfaces, where that's a direct nexus to the impairment of Allenbrook. Another possible metric of consideration is strictly construction costs. That is exactly what it sounds like. If your project costs $100,000 to build, that was your amount, that was your weighted amount towards this process. The drawback with that is the more expensive the project, the more money you get, and there may not be perhaps the direct nexus or a nexus to water quality improvements like we were looking for. The third option we discuss here is an average of the impervious cover and the construction costs, a simple split. Impervious percentages, construction cost percentages divided by 2. Those have, it mitigates the construction cost aspect about it a little bit, but still, you can see through the pie charts I have here, it still weights one neighborhood fairly heavily. The fourth option, which is something that was requested after the last select board meeting I was here, was to tie it to the prioritization matrix. And that prioritization matrix, as a reminder, was created for the loan program. Exact same question, if a bunch of neighborhoods come to us and say we want a loan, how do we pick who gets the first loan with a limited amount of funds. So we staff tried to tie those weightings to one of the allocation methods here, and the pie chart kind of speaks for itself. It's very even. The percent distributions vary from like 3% to 10% or something like that, as opposed to some of the different percentages. So it's my understanding we're going to perhaps discuss those and maybe even choose one of those allocation metrics for the grant program.
Thank you. So questions from the board? Questions?
Well, it's
Yeah, my apologies. I should just say that at the very end of this document, staff does recommend an option.
Yes.
And we do recommend option number 1 for some of the reasonings I provided. The main one being there is a fairly direct nexus between impervious cover treated and the issue at hand here. And yeah, I'm happy to go into more detail about why staff is recommending that if desired.
So questions from the board?
did you do any analysis on, for the different options, what, versus, cost to the neighborhoods? Is there any idea of, coming up with the most equitable share of the cost? Because the costs are different per neighborhood, right? So, in other words, does one of these options provide a better average cost, similar average cost, or reimbursement across all the different neighborhoods?
If I understand that correctly, then the one linked to the prioritization metric has the most consistent distributions. I believe you all also have a detailed table here that gets into some of the numbers. And
No, I didn't mean the even across, but I mean even versus the expense for each stormwater pond. So the expense for each neighborhood. So for instance, does one of these options provide a 10% grant coverage for each of the neighborhoods on average? In other words, I know they don't exactly, but does one of these provide the best kind of?
I'm afraid I don't know what you're asking.
I mean, which one comes closest to equalizing cost per share, cost per
Thank you,
household?
thank you, thank you. That's exactly what I meant.
So the matrix option does take into account cost per household. It was one of a number of factors under consideration for the matrix. So that consideration is built in there, and accordingly, the matrix option varies from 2% to 10% max for cost distribution. So
Right, but it's obvious that one doesn't cover equally from a burden perspective. In other words, cost per share or cost per household, because the highest burdened neighborhood with a high, 14,000 or whatever it is per household, they have a fairly small piece of the pie. So I would say it's not a very good distribution versus the cost of, or the burden rate. So,
town staff did not do a direct connection to cost per household.
and for the first one, the impervious cover, do the large shares coincide or closely match the neighborhoods that have very large expenses?
The answer is yes, fairly closely. The top 3 recipients underneath the impervious cover are Southridge, Brennan Woods, and Meadow Ridge. They do have among the highest construction costs. That is not true across the board, obviously. There are a couple other neighborhoods that have higher construction costs,
Right.
but due to the amount they're treating, don't get quite as much.
So it seems like it's a decision between spreading it like peanut butter, which, I mean, we use that term all the time, and we spread, the pain by peanut butter, the budget cuts or whatever, or we provide benefit to the neighborhoods that have the highest burden per household.
Or a direct nexus to the issue at hand.
Agreed, and certainly the last one doesn't seem, it seems like the peanut butter approach, and I'm not sure that's in the benefit of the, I'm kind of, with the options that we have, I think the first one, the impervious cover, provides the best representation of the options that have been proposed. So I don't know what the other board members think.
Comments or questions?
It's more of a comment than it is a question. I think costs, I mean, the reason for requesting a grant is to help defer the cost.
Exactly.
And so using that, if you will, nexus, I have a hard time, I haven't figured out why we wouldn't want cost to be a part of how we allocate that money. I mean, I can understand when the state has a grant program, they're very interested in the money's going out to do what you want the money to do, whether it's clean up a lake or water quality or what have you. But our sole reason for getting this money, going after these grants, I shouldn't say sole, but probably the key reason, is to help reduce the burden. And that's why I think cost needs to be at least a part of it.
Well, we've looked at various formulas, Rick. One of the things we've talked about in the past, and I've mentioned, is just adding I think, James, you've done a 50%, you basically looked at 50% cost and 50% construction cost and 50% impervious surface.
Yeah, I took
What if the cost
allocation-
was a different factor? Is that what you're suggesting?
Well, I am tending more towards option 2, which is the combination of impervious plus cost, as opposed to option 1. But that's just leaning at this point.
Right.
And I'm very interested in hearing what others have to say.
Can I ask a question? The first, looking at the memo that you have, figure 1 is construction costs?
Figure 1 should be impervious cover final
Impervious, I'm sorry, right, that's what I meant. And figure 2 is construction
You want
cost.
this one?
Yes.
Okay. Figure 3 is impervious construction cost average. Can you tell me can you explain that process a little bit more?
Sure.
Impervious cover, construction cost average.
Yeah, and actually, we can probably look at the biggest contributor for the second two there. In figure 2 with construction costs, about half of the pie is one neighborhood, that'd be Meadow Ridge. In figure 1, one of those pies is about 14% for Meadow Ridge. So those two values are around 46% and around 14%. The average of 46 and 14 is around 30. So on in figure 3, which is the 2, that slice of the pie, that's third of the circle, is Meadow Ridge. So it really was just a simple add and divide, straight average.
So it was an attempt to kind of factor in both how much impervious cover each neighborhood has and how much construction cost they're looking at.
Yep, and underneath that method, you could weight them in any way. Right now, they're weighted equally. You could have construction costs weighted at 70% or at 30%, and that would, of course, change the distribution. Just to reiterate one thing that's in my memo here is one of the dangers with construction costs is if we do choose to go that route, there should also be some discussion about how we treat pre-existing systems and systems that weren't constructed, and also perhaps some consideration of the systems that were maintained pretty well as opposed to the systems that weren't maintained that well at all. And how do we take that into account when distributing based on construction costs?
That's always a difficulty with grant and loan programs, is you don't want to reward not doing, maintaining or what have you.
Has anybody maintained stormwater systems?
No,
I haven't heard of anybody. I know our neighborhood has done nothing. Has any neighborhood actually done maintenance on a expired stormwater system?
Certainly, general maintenance. One way to also frame this is not going out of their way to undo a system. There are a couple in the neighborhood that ended up being dumping grounds for Christmas trees and lawn clippings.
Well, that's yeah.
And so they did come into this process in a variety of different standings. Other neighborhoods have been mowing their ponds and keeping them in relatively good working order. to the maximum extent that they
Well,
can.
from that standpoint, I guess we maintain ours, but I would say we really didn't maintain it. We mowed it because it was an eyesore if we didn't mow it.
I just brought it up as a concept that's out there, as, people deal with grant and loan programs.
I actually would lean toward some combination of construction costs and impervious surface. I think both concepts are good. I don't, I am, again, there's no good answer to any of these questions. Impervious absolutely has a wonderful logic to it, that it is tied directly to the problem. But on the other hand, the people who live in those neighborhoods didn't create the problem. And likewise, construction costs would be a huge distribution one way, but on the other hand, I think it's something that has to be factored into, because one of the concepts here is that we're trying to take grant money and mitigate the harm of the entire issue. Again, this is a perfect example of, not that we're legislators, but how legislation is like watching sausage being made. It's just not good. But you were saying that you had you wanted more construction costs.
I think pretty much exactly what you said, and it should be a combination. I don't know how to weight them, so maybe 50/50 is the best I can come up with right now.
50/50 is what we have in front of you for this, I guess we'll call it option 3. It's the figure 3. It's very simple to adjust those weightings to whatever the board desires.
I guess my question is what, I wouldn't know myself what weight to give those two things. And I wouldn't know, and within that, in terms of, there's policy considerations that involve the science of it and involve the nexus between the impervious surface and the actual problem, and then there's the burden on the neighborhoods. Whatever weight that we give to these two factors is probably not going to be scientific by the time it ends anyway, if it is now at 50/50. I don't know where we go with what I just said, but I felt like saying it.
Any further comments from the board? Questions?
One question I guess I have, James, you brought up this would need some additional, if this is the direction the select board wants to go, this combining the combination 2, or I think it's option 2, what additional work would need to end up in this policy? Is it option 3?
Option 3.
I'm sorry, option 3, the impervious construction. You're right, it is option 3. What additional work would be needed to the stormwater grant policy?
Might want to ask Rick that question.
Oh, it's just changing a sentence or two.
Okay, so that issue about, you were talking a little bit how we'd need to adjust.
I was simply saying if a desire between impervious cover and construction costs is the direction the board wants to go, what you have in front of you right now and associated values are based on a 50/50 split. So if for some reason you wanted to change that distribution, we could just recalculate that.
So should we ask them to do a kind of a 10 to 90, it's just a spreadsheet calculation, and see what the cost, the benefit per homeowner burden is, right? In other words, are we getting 10, 20, 30%?
We
Looking for the
could,
kind of the closest.
but I actually might argue against that, and here's
Okay,
why.
yep.
And because we could go through umpteen iterations of how to
Sure.
look at this. Ultimately, we have to choose it based on what we philosophically think the sausage making is the right approach. And I just don't want to get too swayed by, I like the way these numbers work out, then I feel like I can defend it from the best process, if you will. I don't know if that makes sense.
I wanted to see something that looks like we're giving the neighborhoods, the neighbors that have the highest burden getting a good share, right? Getting a decent share. So I don't know if we have numbers that show that, but
So you would like, for instance, at the 50/50, per household, how does that end up in each neighborhood?
Right, not per neighborhood, because some neighborhoods have 200 homeowners.
Right.
And some neighborhoods have
No,
50.
but per household within the neighborhood.
Yes, kind of looking at, can we equalize the burden somehow and, or the benefit to the burden, I guess, or actually equalize the burden at the end of the day, right?
So wouldn't the answer then be, we take whatever we get in a grant, divide it by the number of households in all the neighborhoods, and then just each neighborhood, if they have 60 homes, they get 60 times whatever that per household?
But they have different burdens, right?
Yes.
So that's where you don't get the same percentage benefit, right? I was looking, try to equalize the benefit, so
You take the burden, take out minus the grant, then per household.
for the
what
most
is
part,
that?
most people's burdens aren't their own fault, from a philosophical standpoint. People who moved into certain homes end up with an expired permit burden that's not necessarily tied to anything that they did.
Right,
In fact,
I
I would say
agree, yeah.
nobody has that situation, right? Not the Meadow Ridge folks and not people in South Ridge or in my neighborhood, so.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying. I don't think I would be in favor of equalizing entirely, though, because I do think that for the other people in town, there has to be some sort of balancing out. And I think the fact that if you weigh, because otherwise you're getting further and further away from tying the nexus between the impervious surface and the problem. I think that we should come up with a formula that mitigates the extra burdens, but does not get rid of them entirely, unless we get so much grant money that we can just go ahead and do that.
It would be nice.
Yeah.
So you want to end up with a burden, you want to end up with a burden per household consistent with the current share of burden across the entire expense of the stormwater upgrade.
I don't know.
So,
The chart that you produced, the stormwater funding priority matrix, that's a 50-50?
So the one with the stormwater funding prioritization matrix, that was not originally created for this grant program. This was for the loan.
Oh.
So the particular attributes and metrics we have there,
Yeah, a copy, by the way, is included in your packets for that, of that matrix, I believe.
and there actually is a cost per house column. But the problem is for this particular discussion that's sort of rolled into all these other metrics to get their ranking within the prioritization matrix. It's not teased out into its own thing.
so we don't have it on the charts that you sent.
In a way, it's part of the matrix, and the matrix is one of our considerations for the grant. We have two tables. The one that at the top is called grant funding distribution options,
Right?
is the percent breakdown for the 4 different options put forth in my memo. And that lets you put some numbers on, like, in front of your mind, but the matrix is the matrix that's driving how we prioritize these systems in the case of, if they all at once came in for a loan, how would we do that? And a member of the community suggested to us that we use this as a method of allocating funds, and that's what we've done here in the 4th option, as it were.
So we ask members of the audience if they have any comments regarding the grant policy. Sandy?
I would just like to commend this discussion that Select having regarding equitable ways to distribute, because there's more than one here. And I also point out that the neighborhood that has the biggest burden is also in a position potentially to help other neighborhoods obtain grant funds because of the size of the projects in Meadowwood. It's $200,000, $200,000, $400,000 project. And those could be combined in a way to maximize funding opportunities, which will not just benefit Meadow Ridge, obviously, but will benefit all the neighborhoods. So I just want to point out also that Meadow Ridge is ready to undertake those within the timeframes that staff are recommending in terms of the policy so that construction will be completed in 2019.
So, Board, how do you wish to proceed on this tonight?
Can I, just one more
Sure.
question? So I'm looking at the grant funding distribution options chart. Is that the chart that, under impervious construction average? That column is what the 50-50 split?
Yeah, so, to pick on you, Ted, your
Yeah.
neighborhood, we get 3%, and,
Yeah.
and these dollar amounts are assuming that over the course of, this whole process, say, up to 10 years, that we were to get $450,000. I'm not saying that's out of the realm of possibility. That would be great if we got that much, but those numbers assume 450,000, so you can scale that as you will. But that would equal around $12,000 for Turtle Crossing. For Meadow Ridge, that's about $134,000, and they're at 30%. Brennan Woods is at 11% for about $47,000. So again, the percentages are perhaps a better way to think about the breakdown as opposed to the dollars, because they're going to change based on grant distribution.
Further comments, questions? Directions on which way to move tonight?
I am still in favor of option 3.
Am I?
Is that, if that's impervious construction average, I am too.
That is correct. I believe I got my options right this time, numbers right.
I'd be happy for that one, too.
So, can we make a motion on that, or do we wait to see how it asks for a revision to the policy and then?
Yeah, I think this will require some minor modifications to language, excuse me. And so, as long as, maybe the board would like to take a vote on this, so at least we can put, not on the policy, but rather the option, so we can put that to bed, and then it'll be a simple matter of, and we can proceed, because we have some grants. In fact, we submitted a pre-application yesterday for one potentially huge grant.
Oh, our fingers are crossed.
So that'll allow that process to keep going.
Okay, so I move to adopt a neighborhood stormwater grant distribution policy based on option number 3 in James Sherrard's memo dated, let's see, May 25th, 2017.
Your second.
Second.
Just a minor thing, you referred to it as a neighborhood stormwater grant distribution policy?
Yes.
And the formal title is neighborhood stormwater grant policy. Distribution isn't part of it.
Well, we're not voting on the policy, we're voting on
Oh,
the
okay.
distribution policy, right? Because we're going to vote on the, so I think I worded it right. We're not voting on the document, we're voting on which one of these options we want.
Okay.
And then Rick's going to update, I think, the document.
I
on
see
the
a lot of
next
people
slide.
nodding their heads, so I'll go along with that. And,
Discussion on the motion.
no,
If there is
thank you,
none-
James, yeah, for this, all
Those
this.
in favor of the motion say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed?
All right.
Abstentions, all right. So we can move along then to the next item, which is the residential expired permit policy. And who of you which would like to talk about this?
I'll start it off, and then I can have probably Jennifer pick up one piece. What we tried to do is respond to the specific requests for additional information that we received at the last board meeting. This was discussed in depth. And one of that pieces was to look at the rates based on a phased implementation, and that's what I'll have Jennifer speak to. And the board also wanted to see a simplified chart showing, using information that had been provided by Whale Tanner, and that's included in my memo to the board on the topic of evaluation factors. So with that, I think I'll turn it over to Jennifer.
So one of the questions that came up on May 9th was about the analysis that was done by Hoyle and Tanner shared the number at 20 years, or the rate increase at 20 years. So the question from the board and from the community was, what does that look like more phased in? So don't show us 0 to 20 years, show us what happens in 5 years, 10 years, and 20 years. So what I did is I went back and I looked at the assumptions that we've been sharing with the board for the past couple years and said, I'm not going to make up new assumptions, I'm just going to base it on what we've already been thinking all along. So that's where I came up with 80% of the expired permits would be done by year 5. That's based on a cash flow that was done a couple years ago. 100% of the expired permit projects would be done by year 10, because that's what our flow restoration plan says. And then these other expenses would happen. We wouldn't have to do the 10-year forebay until 10 years, forebay dredging. And we wouldn't have to do the main pond dredge until 20 years. So that I added those assumptions in. And then I prepared this, looking at those different options, and added in any additional assumptions that we had to make for the different options, and showed you those, what the rates would look like at year 5, year 10, and year 20. And we do understand that since the analysis was done by Hoyle and Tanner, there has been an updated number for forebay dredging. We think while this would change these numbers, it would change them all consistently. So if they would all go down by $2 if that number is inflated, or they would all go up by $2 if they're underestimated. So that is one of the items that we prepared based on that discussion. And I think James has another item.
Sure, with regards to the table,
Yes.
it's the table titled Ratepayers Estimated Increase. I believe, Jeff, specifically you would like to see some breakouts about farms, how they
Yes.
could be affected. And in general, is the will of the board to sort of break down these cost increases by sector. So staff's broken this up into 4 different categories. Williston single-family residential, those are all the homes that are getting just 1 ERU for a billing. Farms, commercial/industrial, that's kind of a catch-all for basically anything that's not a single-family residence or farm or owned by the town.
Okay.
And the last category there, town of Williston, are our roads and non-roads. And just as an important aside, that would essentially be the tax increase portion that the general fund pays. You could interchange the town of Williston with general fund increase. The options going across, you can see that option 3 and 5 are identical because they don't begin to separate in this particular analysis till after 20 years. Happy to chat about any of these costs that you see in there. Oh, and also it's important to point out that this doesn't include future upgrades and major repairs. In the Hoyle and Tanner analysis, it was just based on expired permit system upgrades and maintenance. It's not taking into account the acts of God or big repairs in 20 years from now. And also, I guess one other caveat is it is very likely that rates will rise over the next 10 years in some way, shape, or form. This doesn't take into account that. This would be solely in addition to what decision we make based on the options.
So are there questions or comments from the board?
So my first question is, why do you think that the cost of maintenance doesn't affect any of the options differently?
Because they all have the same maintenance.
Well, do they? Because I thought if we take care of only the expired permit neighborhoods, that's a certain amount of maintenance, right? If we add in the non-expired permit maintenance, isn't that a much bigger number now?
I believe what Jennifer's trying to get at is, we're assuming all of these are ponds and that they're all going to be maintained in a certain way. So whether the number's 18 ponds that we take over underneath, option 1, for example, or whether it's all the systems in the town of Williston, per pond, we're estimating the cost at the same way.
But that's not what we're making a decision on. The numbers would change between the options if you change the maintenance cost. I mean, that's kind of what we're looking at, is the cost per option. So that it isn't really flat. It's very lumpy.
It changes them all similarly, because if you're doing, like, option 1, the current path, for example, we're only doing 18 ponds. That is the lowest option.
Yep.
In that we would do 18 ponds, would have less of a cost. In option 3, where it's all in, you would have all 43 ponds, and they would all be at that lower rate. So it doesn't change one and suddenly option 1 is less expensive for the ratepayers than option 3. It doesn't change how they relate to one another, I should say.
Well, it makes them much closer in dollar amounts, because the magnitude of the increase will go down significantly with a significant decrease in maintenance cost, actually.
Which is why this little chart showing percentages is kind of useful.
Yeah, so just my point is that it changes the numbers pretty significantly. Even though the cost per pond changes the same, the cost of the options to homeowners, and especially when we talk about multi-ERU burdens like on the farms, that makes some options look very unattractive because of the high maintenance costs, and others would look better. So my point on the different estimate, or a more realistic estimate done by an industry expert of 30 years who's done this for a job successfully, is a better estimate than an academic paper. So that was my first point. So, and it does change. I think it would definitely change my decision-making if I found out that the Fontaines would, instead of a $3,000 increase, we're going to see a $1,000 increase or a $500 increase. It would make a big difference in my decision-making. So it's a significant difference. The other thing was just the process, and we talked about it a little bit, Rick, the last time we met, and that is that when Hoyle Tanner did the report, they did a 20-year dredge, and then they came up with a 20-year reconstruction fee, if you will, that was based on the initial pond expired permit, unmaintained pond construction fee. So we took the worst possible scenario of all these ponds being unmaintained, some being, as James brought up, unbuilt, and we said, well, we're just going to dump that again at 20 years, and on top of that, they have to be dredged too. Well, the thing we're forgetting is that the single biggest cost and expense for all of the work we've done, I know for our pond, is dredging the pond in the first place, because it hasn't been dredged in 20 some years. That's the biggest expense we have. So you've taken that, which is the biggest part of the initial, for the most part, the construction fees that we're all seeing for the expired permits, and you're adding that on top of the average construction fee that we ended up in the first, that we paid for, or are paying for, to fix these expired permit ponds. So you're kind of double counting, and I would suggest that there's no magical pond expansion, or, for instance, in our neighborhood, we have no room. The pond is the pond. You can either do a dredge in 20 years, and I think that's typical of many of the ponds. You can do a dredge in 20 years, which I would suggest is probably the only thing that can and should be done in 20 years or planned for. This other thing about new requirements magically appearing at 20 years, I don't think is realistic. And anyway, it's a double count. You should remove a significant portion of that cost that you've estimated.
May I please
20 years.
address the double count comment, because I think it's
Yeah.
important to clarify something. The costs you're seeing with regards to the ERU increases by both Jennifer's estimates based on 5, 10, and 20 years and my estimates here, they do not include those major upgrades. So there are no double countings in these ERU increases. Specifically left out of these ERU increases are any major upgrades. So that issue can be placed aside when looking at these tools here. Also, the dredging quotes were provided to us both by estimates we got from professionals, and South Burlington looked over a lot of our assumptions and came back with us and said those dredging quotes look about right, similar for things we've done. So just wanted to add that again for the discussion.
Well, the dredging, we agree. The dredging quote looked, we actually did a requote on the dredge too, and it looked reasonable, the 20-year dredge. So we agree with that. So I guess I'm confused because the 20-year numbers that I saw in the document, well, Jennifer's document, the 20-year ERU increases looked a lot like the numbers from the Hoyle Tanner.
Yep, the Hoyland.
I didn't redo Hoyle and Tanner's report. He paid them to do that report. I used that report. What I heard from the conversation was take that report and show us what it would look like in 5 years. And we're getting to the same number. If we'd like to have Hoyle and Tanner redo the report, that's a different request.
Well, and Hoyle and Tanner never had the ERUs include that third category. They never included the major upgrades and repairs. So if we're looking at the table with the 4 different user groups, under option 1, you'll see $14.52 italicized. That's the ERU increase for option 1. Underneath Jennifer's option 1, if you go all the way to year 20, it's $14.52. That's essentially saying you're eventually going to hit that same ERU rate, and all these ERU rates do not take into account any major future upgrades or repairs.
Well, I thought the future upgrade and repair was the expired stormwater permit total cost divided by the number of, coming up with that average cost and adding it as that future cost that was brought back to present cost. I thought that was a part of this analysis. You're telling me that the numbers in here just reflect maintenance?
Just for the ERUs. The ERUs that we're using to represent the potential increases in costs here. That is something that I spoke to Mike Schramm about directly, and that is what he reiterated for me. So that is the case for the consideration of these documents that we put together.
So Teresa, when you mentioned we, are you speaking for your homeowners association or some other we?
Oh, I'm sorry, what was I saying?
We're saying
Used
we.
several times.
Oh,
We're
I'm
asking
sorry.
who we is. You said we ran those numbers, we agree, and that we were just trying to determine who we is when you've used that statement.
Oh, Chris and I ran the numbers. So I thought these numbers included that final construction cost, which Mike talked about and we discussed at length during the meeting. So I'm trying to figure out, those numbers are not included in the financial calculation that Mike did? Because I certainly thought they were, and
They were in the
certainly on a
totals.
spreadsheet.
They were in the totals.
Yeah, they were included.
I thought so too. So I think the numbers that we see here include that 20-year construction cost.
So to the best of my knowledge and based on the last conversation I had verbally with Mike Schramm, while the analysis at the very bottom did have fairly large numbers, 4 million to 12 million, give or take, those did include that third category. What I'm trying to say is that the ERUs that we based all of these increases on, that ERU value did not include that final upgrade piece. Now, obviously, there's a lot of question about this. I'll reach out to him again, but that is my understanding of these values.
I mean, I've got it here.
Yeah,
Didn't include it.
that's what I thought too. We stared at these numbers for a long time. So, and the fact that the 20-year numbers double, to me says that there's a large expense included in that last half that's not $20,000 a pond. Because How many ERUs are there? There's 15,000 approximately, James? 14,500 or something?
Roughly 14,500.
So,
It is the first footnote in the table I provided, and clearly I'll double check that, but that was put in there after a discussion with our consultants.
that was my second point. I think I'm correct in saying that the numbers include the construction costs, because that was a big part of the discussion that we had. And if Mike could have cleared that up in an instant, if he said, oh, that's just for reference, we didn't include that, but he included that in the analysis of the costs, in the sense the final.
The total number of costs, but that's my understanding as well from what I read in the document, but it's not included in the
Okay, well,
Jennifer, actually, does anybody have the Hoyle Tanner report?
Yep.
And I'm wondering if you're referring to the items that are on line 11.
What page? Oh,
I'm sorry,
chart.
attachment 3. My bad.
this is from May 9th.
Yeah. And I can show this to you if you'd like.
Attachment 3, the number that we're referring to that's not included in there is line item 15.
Right. But what I'm getting at is when I look at line 11, where they estimate what the increase will be in the fee, it appears those numbers do not include upgrade and major repair shares.
Yeah, and,
Right.
If I read this table correctly, I may be reading it incorrectly.
no, yeah, it
That's
says it
what
right in the beginning of row 11. Annual share cost per ERU of capital and O&M costs over 20 years. It does
So-
not include that third category of future major upgrades.
Okay. And your point, Terry, seems to be, you're just saying it should, it just, what we were presented with on May 9th didn't.
Right.
And so what, Jennifer, you did, I just trying to make sure I understand the whole conversation that's going on, was consistent with what Hoyle Tanner did in coming up with their increase in the cost of the ERUs,
Yeah.
what the ERUs will need to be. And the only other question, I'm sorry, I have about the table you put together, and thank you, because I find this helpful, is on the farms, they have the ability to, I think it's up to a 50% credit on if they meet certain,
10% credit, 40% grant.
okay, thank you. Is that reflected in here?
No,
No, okay, so this would be if they did not do whatever upgrades they needed to, or didn't apply for the credit and grant.
or if they fell out of compliance with their state RAPs, then they'd lose both the credit and the grant
Okay.
through the town, yes.
Further questions or comments from the
Yeah,
board?
I guess I'm still not comfortable that so I'm just looking at one of the tables, and I'm on page 12.
Page 12 of the Hoyle Tanner
Tanner?
report. Page 6, 7, 10.
This one.
Yeah, now so I'm trying to figure out how you determined that that value isn't present worth of future upgrade at 20 years.
Terry, I have a question.
So,
If someone was trying to look up the report, is that in the May 9th packet?
it is,
Yes.
it is.
Sorry.
So, it's online.
You're looking at the big chart?
Yeah, I am. I'm looking at line 11, and it does say that, so the only question I would have is, why did we discuss the 20-year upgrade costs? I guess I'm still uncomfortable unless I go back and run the numbers, but my impression was at the meeting on May 9th that it did include the 20-year numbers because we discussed those. If it doesn't, then I would say that that's probably a good thing, that it doesn't. And I'm still surprised that the ERUs that are so large for just maintenance, and then I would say, well, that's probably because the maintenance are 2 to 3 times what they should be. But that still should be looked at. The maintenance costs should be run at a more reasonable estimate.
Yeah,
But-
and if that is something that the board requests, that is something we will have to go back to Hoyle and Tanner and ask them to do. They've done a pretty deep analysis here, and it's not something that we internally can recreate the work that we paid them.
Well, they just ran a spreadsheet because they didn't do any consulting, right? They provided the spreadsheet to us. Couldn't we plug in the numbers, different numbers, and come up with a range?
It's not that simple. The values they gave us for the present worth analyses are not something that you can just fill in some cells and have it calculated out. That's something they did in-house.
So the question is, if we take no action, the existing permit policy stands. If we wish to modify it, we would need to do that. Do we need more information before we get to that point?
Well, one thing I think we haven't talked about yet, and we talked about it previously, not tonight, but we still need to talk about is the concept of, will the policy include the non-expired residential homeowners permits? I guess maybe that's the way to put it. And let me start by saying, after I don't know how many years we've been talking about this and trying to think through all this, I've come to the conclusion that I think we need to include the other group, I don't know how to correctly, the neighborhoods with valid permits. I have a hard time understanding how we can differentiate between the expired permits and the valid permits. So that's just how one of the caveats I'm starting with when we come to actually voting for or against, or not voting at all.
I would agree, it's an equity discussion. It's
Yeah.
and I like the idea that people who are paying us the stormwater fee get something for their utility fee. So,
So this is option number 3.
Well, option number 3, in terms of at least the routine maintenance, major repairs, and upgrades, the improvement cost is still to be discussed.
it would be nice to see more realistic numbers in there to get an idea of what the impact is for that. So, because we're showing it now as,
Well, we do know, we know a couple things about option 3. Going to Jennifer's, hope you don't mind if I refer to it that way, Jennifer's table. And option 3, at least as it is it is calculated, which is the 60-40 split between the neighborhoods and the stormwater fund. That split could change. We could change that split. Right now, the way the policy currently reads is it's 100% zero split, if that's the right word for what 100% and zero is, which would drastically reduce, I shouldn't say drastically, I'm not sure how much, it would reduce that cost. On the other hand, if it was 100%, it would increase that cost. But option 3, my understanding right now, is built on a split of the improvement cost of 60% neighborhoods, 40% stormwater fund, and I want to make sure that's correct.
I would reference Rick's table on his memo that breaks out the percentage costs based on the options. And in option 3, 90%, 91% of the ongoing burden, financial burden, would be that of the stormwater fund. The 9% for the expired permits would be with regards to their upgrades currently, and 0% for the valid permits.
Okay, but then the question becomes is, that's option 3 with the improvement cost split being 60% neighborhoods, 40% towns. If that was to draw, I'd like to understand, right now, the way the policy currently reads is the improvement cost split is 100% neighborhoods, 0% stormwater
Yes.
fee.
Yes.
I would like to understand what the cost is, or the split would be, under that scenario. So that would be, a modified option 3, if you will. Does that make sense? And I guess I might as well just get this out now, because I'm going to have to say it at some point. I think the original, in the adopted policy, where the select board decided that the improvement cost would be on the neighborhoods, but the future maintenance and improvement cost would be on the stormwater fund, I think that was a good deal. And I still feel that's a real benefit to the neighborhoods. So I would like to understand what the cost impacts would be if we kept it at that 100% neighborhoods for the improvement costs, 0% stormwater fee. Does all that make sense?
I believe that 9% for the expired permits would go up slightly if we were not contributing based on the 60%. I don't know what that number would be.
Or how much, the other big piece of it is how much does it reduce the stormwater fund portion? I mean, that is as important as how much does it increase the cost to the neighborhoods. Now, we could wait and get that information, but I'm going to argue against that, because I'm not so sure. I mean, we have to make a decision sometime.
Yep.
And we need to make it sooner than later. And again, to me, it gets down to philosophy as much as it's, down to the hard numbers. Did you get my point there?
I did, and the only thing I'd say is that we pay ERUs, right? All of us pay ERUs. Then we pay tax ERUs because we're taxed on the town roads. And the town roads are also covered and chopped up by ERUs, so we pay taxes on the ERUs for the town roads. So as, the neighborhoods, if you will, are burdened not only with our own properties, and I shouldn't have any more burden than you. We have, if we have similar sized houses and driveways, I don't have any more impervious surface than you do. I don't own the road or control it. I don't maintain it. And as South Burlington has done, they found it, in their own words, it was an equitable process to come up with.
We have to find our equitable process.
No, of course, and I think your point about
Valid permit?
sharing the burden is valid too, but remember, the only people being burdened right now are the ones in the neighborhoods. And what we're asking for is the town to take the share of the roads on that initial cost. Everybody else will be burdened by what could be a $5 increase or something, so, I still feel pretty strongly that the town surfaces should be covered by town costs. And I think maybe at the end of the day, that's like a $3 difference in the ERU. At least for the, for the $560,000 or $80,000 of cost associated in the residential expired permit upgrade process, right? It was $1.8 million. I think $560,000 or $80,000 was attributable to the road area itself. You'd have to go back to the.
Yeah, I just,
James probably has a number on the top of his, and I took that number and divided it out by the number of ERUs to come up with a value over 20 years,
Yeah,
which was, I think, $3, or a little less than 3.
if we, option, well, yeah, I don't know what that cost would be.
Right, well, we can ask James for it, or, I think it's about $3, so, and then I really support the idea about, covering the
Valid permits?
the valid permits, right, so.
How much would that cost over the, I mean, do we have that number and I've just missed it? If we covered the valid permits by taking over their maintenance and upkeep from here to eternity, how much is that going to change?
So that would be best represented by the report Horland Tanner did, and including the future major upgrades and repairs. That type of program would cost us around $11.5 million.
For what?
For all of the town stormwater funds.
Per year, per 10 years?
Over 20 years.
Over 20 years.
And the option we're currently on is around $4.5 million. So the risk in about a 20-year period is somewhere in the order of $7 million more for the town of Williston stormwater fund and the ERU period. 20 years. If I may, Mr. Chair, I did write a memo, and I'd appreciate it if we're getting close to perhaps making a decision to be able to read a small portion of it to the board as they're doing their decision-making. Thank you. If you did get this memo, it was May 31st, dated May 31st, so I'm just going to read a portion of it. A number of the options before the board will include incorporation of the valid residential permits, and this will guarantee a considerable expansion of the stormwater program. In order to maintain regulatory compliance with the additional permits, the stormwater program will require additional administrative staff, dedicated maintenance staff, and additional equipment. This accelerated scope of expansion was not originally anticipated in the formation of the stormwater program. Furthermore, the town will invite a level of infrastructure and regulatory risk and uncertainty which may intensify the need to raise rates. As this infrastructure ages, the difference between ownership of 18, the expired permits, or 43, all the town permits, will significantly raise maintenance and upgrade costs. With the passage of Act 64, the implementation of the Lake Champlain Phosphorus TMDL, and the state's inability to provide direct guidance on the responsibilities associated with towns impervious located within these expired permits, we are in an exceptionally turbulent regulatory period. This regulatory permitting risk, while difficult to quantify, once again increases the likelihood of growing ERU rates directly affecting Williston residents and businesses. Therefore, given the level of risk and uncertainty in this quickly changing regulatory landscape and the relative youth of Williston's stormwater program, it's staff's recommendation to the Select Board to remain on our current path, option 1, for the near to mid-future. As our utility matures and the state's regulatory environment stabilizes, we will be better suited to revisit the options currently before the board for consideration. I do appreciate the opportunity to read that out loud, and I'm also happy to take any further questions as you discuss.
James, do you mind if I thank you, and I think I understand pretty much exactly, or 100% what you're saying. But philosophically, I guess the question becomes is, would, under the current option one, the current whatever plan, are we treating one group of permit holders differently than another group? And what would be the justification for doing that? Do you mind that I ask in that fashion?
No, and, since
already
coming
did,
on
I
board
get that,
here,
but, yeah.
it's been my understanding that these systems have become expired, so they've already been treated differently by the state for a number of years. In recognition of that, the town has made what is, in my opinion, a fairly generous offer. We will incorporate your permit into our MS4 permit, which makes all future operation and maintenance and future
Goes away.
upgrades disappear. In the long term, that cost is very difficult to quantify, but it's massive. For perpetuity, these neighborhoods no longer have to pay anything. So yes, it is a one-time cost, and I'm not minimizing that for these neighborhoods, but that was the deal. So
It's a huge
yes, we
cost.
are treating them differently in a manner we hope is fair. And the reason we're treating them differently than the valid permits is those valid permits have had, they haven't had liens on their titles. They haven't had clouds on their titles. They haven't had to do transfer permits of expired stormwater permits. They haven't been in limbo as with regards to their permitting status. So by virtue what the state has created, they're already different, and therefore we must treat them slightly differently. The option one that's put forth is, again, in my opinion, a good deal long-term, and does meet a lot of the requirements that, all the requirements we need to meet for the state.
Thank you.
And I actually, I'm gonna say, Jeff, I agree with the idea. I don't agree with covering the neighborhoods who do not have expired permits. I wish that we could, because it would be a very easy solution. But I do think there's a difference between the 18 neighborhoods that are going to have to expend significant amounts of money and the other neighborhoods who are newer and haven't had this, they're not going to have this burden. As when my kids were in daycare, I remember the phrase that was used over and over again was, fair doesn't mean equal. I don't know if this is fair or not. It probably could, I don't think anything's going to be fair in this. I do think that the select board policy that was in place when I got back on is the one that is in place now. I think it is a pretty good deal. I think the interesting thing about it is that, it's a voluntary program. Nobody has to do it. You could go to the state yourself and take care of it that way. The question is, should it be more generous? Is it too generous in comparing this to the residences that don't have expired permits? I think this is the best balance and I agree, in a very turbulent situation. I mean, the state's bureaucratic and regulatory leadership in this area has been really bad, and I don't expect that's going to change. So I'm concerned about a lot of things, not the least of which is if we hook on to basically giving neighborhoods an entitlement, which these 18 neighborhoods are getting, and we've talked about why that has some balance to it, whether it's complete balance or not, I don't know. But if we hook on to all the other things and all the other non-expired permit neighborhoods in town, that is creating an entitlement. And by that, there's a legal definition, meaning like you get this money if you meet the criteria, period. And your criteria is you have a stormwater infrastructure and permit, then the town is going to pay for that into infinity. And I'm really worried about what that cost would be. So I agree, this is a really awful issue. But I think I'm going to keep, my vote would be to keep the policy as it is.
It's, I know we always think, we have talked about this a lot of times, more than I'd like to think about, but when you say entitlement, I never think of it as an entitlement because I think one of the residents here before talked about it and talked about paying their school tax when they have no more kids in the school. It's a public good, and The fact that these 18 or 40-some neighborhoods have stormwater ponds is primarily a result of the town's planning. It's not the result of neighborhoods, it's a result of the way the town wants to do development. The primary runoff from the roads is what fills the stormwater ponds. It's not from the houses themselves like any other house that's not in a neighborhood. So we provide, the neighborhoods that have these stormwater infrastructures provide the benefit to the rest of the town, and the cost we expend on those, like when we pay for school taxes, benefits the general good of the town. I don't see it as an entitlement. The fact that we have a stormwater pond is a burden. The fact that somebody living a quarter mile down the road doesn't have one and has the same impervious surface as I do says that there is a general inequity in taking care of our water quality. The people in neighborhoods by which the town is pushing all of the development by virtue of its bylaws and its ordinances, pushes us, the residential growth, into neighborhoods, therefore pushes the burden onto those homeowners who are in neighborhoods. Only, this is new though, because when we moved in there, we didn't accept that burden. When I moved into Heritage Meadow, nobody told me that, by the way, 5 years from now, somebody's going to come up with some new scheme that says, you're going to carry the stormwater burden along with these other neighborhoods for the rest of the town. So we do that, and I think the neighborhoods are carrying that public good burden for the water quality of the lake. And I hardly feel like I'm entitled. I mean, I feel like I'm disentitled.
Can I jump in for a second?
Yeah.
I didn't use the term like there's in common nomenclature. I mean it as a budgetary term. Like Social Security is an entitlement.
Sure.
What I'm talking about is the neighborhoods that have permits that are up to date. If we create a policy here tonight that says from now on, the town is going to pay for your upkeep and your maintenance of your stormwater infrastructure, that policy is an entitlement relative to those people. I'm not saying entitlement in terms of like a...
I understand.
Well,
Yeah.
it didn't sound like it.
Sure.
The entitlement of what I'm talking about is like Social Security is an entitlement.
Yeah.
Medicare, Medicaid is an entitlement. Stormwater policy, if we pay for it town-wide, the policy will become a budgetary entitlement.
But Ted, just respectfully, I mean, I'm just thinking about this in terms of a public good. These neighborhoods are doing they're taking care of the primary burden of stormwater maintenance for the town. These 18 and 46 or however many neighborhoods we have, we do the primary water quality work in the town. I mean, there's a couple of other small things happening outside, but for the most part, and why shouldn't the burden of water quality be spread across the town rather than a few residences? Just by virtue of the fact that we're pushing our development, our homeowner development, we're pushing it towards these, what do you call them? These residential configurations. PUDs, thank you, planned unit developments. So that's what the town pushes. So they push us into this configuration. So I just look at it as trying to share the burden. And however we cut the initial cost, whether it's 40/60, 80/20, or dump it all, I mean, we're burdened more than everybody else for improving the water quality in the lake.
I think, I'm having a problem with that. It's not that we as neighborhoods are improving anything. I mean, you bought in a neighborhood that has a permit that had specific requirements with it, and part of it was maintaining those stormwater ponds. So I guess I'm trying to get away from this, we're doing this overall public service. You're complying with a permit that goes with your land that you knew when you bought the property. That's the only difference I want to put out there. It's not like each neighborhood's doing this wonderful public service. They're doing what they're supposed to do.
The water quality work is only required because the development exists in the first place.
Exactly.
If it was an open field.
Absolutely, and the road is part of that. And we create these developments because we want to increase the population and allow people to live here. So, but again, you have the same, from just looking from an equity perspective, Ted. A house, for instance, on Jack, he doesn't live in a planned unit development. He has the same impervious surface. If we're talking about an ERU, we call it a utility fee. What do we get for our utility fees, right? I'm going to get, now that I'm in one of these 18 expired permit neighborhoods, I'm going to get some benefit as a result of that utility fee. And I'm going to get some work and some stormwater maintenance as a result of that. People in neighborhoods that don't have expired permits, they will get nothing.
Yep. But they won't have to pay for the infrastructure to come up to snuff in the first place.
So let me go to.
Well, it's up to snuff, right? They would have to, so if we go with like a South Burlington policy, we would have somebody go in and inspect the pond to make sure it's at the current level before we would take it over. You know, that's,
Yeah.
they have kind of a process and policy by which they do that.
So let me interrupt the question and answers here and go to the audience and see if there's any comments from folks out there. So if you would please identify yourself when you speak. So I'll start over here with the gentleman in the light blue shirt.
Hi, I'm Nathan Andrews from Meadow Ridge.
Saying, no, that's an obligation of the homeowners association for those particular putts. We're here trying to figure out, are we going to undo a policy that we're working on tonight and redo it and modify it? And I think that's the question we're all trying to determine at this point. It's not, I'm not going backwards and sitting there saying town does or doesn't have obligations. I think we're sitting here trying to go, do we undo this policy and rework it a different way? That was the question that I was working on.
So do you then agree that the town has a responsibility to take care of the town roads, just like I as a homeowner have a responsibility to take care of?
There is a balancing act that needs to be done. It's not a yes or no, black or white answer. I'm sorry. It's a lot more complicated than that.
So I'll go to the gentleman in the back.
Larry, Michael O'Connor, and there's Joy. I'm going to just come dovetail with this because the conversation was going real well. I kind of hit a little roadblock. Your point about, these PUDs and not taking care of maintenance over time. We've been dealing with this for 15 years. The state cashed our check at Indian Ridge for our permit and never issued it. We still allow the consultants to come in and look in to make sure that we're in compliance as reasonably as possible. 15 years now. The issue that I think was brought up, and Ted touched on it, and so did Jeff. Remember, this was a lawsuit from the Conservation Law Foundation about the Clean Water Act of the state of Vermont. Okay? We're all stuck in this, and yet you just had the most thorough discussion about why we're at a roadblock at a time when we've spent so much time working on this together, and that's the value of this. The value of this is we're working together. The second value is the communities are providing water quality protection for the Allen Brook, and we're not getting credit for that. In our case alone, just in Indian Ridge, our estimation right now is $2,000 a household. In addition to taxes and everything else that we've talked about, because we're getting assessed in feed, and we're still getting charged for the stormwater on top of it. If anything, we should be getting a rebate. I should get a rebate for 2 years because we're getting a we can't even get out of the starting gate. That's a problem. And no one wants to digress from that. But we've got to find a way to just answer the question that you just had in discussion. is this legal? Or is what we're doing totally legal in the way we're going about it to get a permit? And I asked the question, has the town had the attorney go to the Agency of Natural Resources, or DNC, and ask him that question? Because I don't even know if the household communities have, but I think that's worth investigating. Because otherwise, we're not going to get a common road, and we need a common road. Because never in history in all the work that I did 35 years in environmental, I can't think of another policy, and that's what we're doing, public policy in the community to move forward, to get an answer that makes sense. And I'll go back as far as the billboard law. If you've ever been in Vermont back then, I'm 60 years old, but they found a way to mitigate the billboard law, and it wasn't $2,000 a household. And that's what the heartburn is here. We're sitting here and I'm debating, do I stay in Williston? Because I'm asking a question to you. Why do I have to pay $2,000 more to live in Williston than any other resident, regardless of what community you're in? That's the question that we're all asking. And it's being debated at the homeowner associations, and we're all trying to find ways to help James move forward. But we're still not getting there. And we need to move forward. Or we need a legal answer. I'm going in the right direction. And I appreciate you giving me the chance to respond.
Thank you. Sandy?
If I could just make a
No, sure.
Please.
comment to you all, please don't think I'm not trying to find an equitable answer. I am. And I am very much listening to everything that's going on. I don't have the answer either. And that's why we're all having this discussion. But I'm getting the impression that you all think that I'm in one, that's not it. I'm just listening, trying to find an equitable answer.
And I appreciate that response back, because James, 2 weeks ago, it's the first time I publicly heard him give credit to the fact that the communities that are taking over the impervious services are providing a service back to the town to help that situation improve. Because frankly, just knowing our own basin, you go putting a dredge machine in there, you're going to put more silt in that thing trying to fix something that's not broke. And again, putting the forebay in that kind of thing, yeah, that's cost. But if that's what we got to do, we got to do it. But we're beating a dead horse if we don't at least admit there's a benefit to what we're doing that helps everybody here in Williston protect water quality. That's what the issue is. And that's all A&R's coming at us with. As long as water quality is being protected and human health is going on fine, we're in good shape.
Sandy, do you have a comment?
Sandy Miller, on some of the analyses that show the ERU rates increasing would be impacted by any grants you receive in a favorable way. And I don't know that any of that, was that taken into consideration?
No, this doesn't take in, what we did not take into account any grants, but you're absolutely right. If the grants are received, then the grants are applied directly toward the portion of the capital cost.
So if the town were to take over take responsibility for the road construction, roughly 40% of any grant proceeds would benefit the town. Is that correct?
That hasn't been determined, but I would
If
think that
it's
is
the
how.
60-40 split, which was one of the options.
What he's saying is if we got grants, and we said we were gonna use 40% as a number for us for the improvements, would we benefit from that, or that grant also? Is that right, Sandy?
Sorry.
Good question.
I don't see how we wouldn't.
I don't
I
either.
think the town should take its fair share of any grant proceeds if it takes responsibility for roadway improvements. And
I would second that.
assuming the town is as successful as it has been in the past with grants, that's going to amount to hundreds of thousands of dollars, reducing the impact on the town's stormwater fund and reducing the ERU costs.
Could be. Chris?
Chris Blondre, and I provided an estimate to Rick, and I copied off each one of the select board members. And when I hear about, Jeff saying he wants to make sure that, or thinks that we're getting a good deal already, you're only thinking that because of these inflated costs that are coming from Mr. Sherrard. I came up with an estimate of just under $4,000 to do a 4-bay dredge. And I didn't just pull I measured them up, I figured out how much they're gonna hold, so I knew how much work was involved. That's how I came up with the estimate. When I start to think about bush hogging, 16 hours twice a year, or 8 hours twice a year, it's only 16 hours. That is just totally way out of whack. Each of the ponds that I've looked at are less than a half an acre. It's going to take less than a half hour, 45 minutes to mow each one of these ponds. And twice a year, to mobilize to the pond and do the job, I mean, you're talking 3 hours tops, not 16. Then when I start to think about the inspection schedule, I say, well, yeah, inspection, pre-inspection and for storms and post-inspection, that's all a good idea. But then I start to think about, my motorcycle was outside because I rode it to work and there was a rain going sideways. And I'm thinking, if I'd known it was going to go sideways, I probably wouldn't have rode my bike. And the point is, when I started to think about that, I started to realize that how practical are these 10 pre-storm inspections? I mean, what kind of storm are we planning on to actually get out and do the inspections? My point is these kinds of storms come up so fast that there's not enough time to actually get out there and do these inspections. And as far as post-inspections, again, what kind of a storm are we talking about? Storms are rated in average per year occurrence, so a 1-year storm on average happens once a year. And that's a pretty small storm when you get right down to it. So the reality is, I don't think the lion's share of these inspections are ever going to take place. And we have catch basins in our neighborhood. I don't think they've ever been inspected this way. I'm sure they've been annually inspected, but other than that, they haven't been inspected prior or after the storms. The bottom line is, this kind of thing is inflating the numbers for the annual maintenance costs that you guys are making your decisions on. And how can you make a decision if you're getting bad information? And with regards to the spreadsheet that Hoyle Tanner sent you, Rick sent me a copy, which was a previous copy. It was kind of like a copy in the works. It wasn't the copy that was presented 2 or 3 weeks ago. And James, you can just plug in some numbers and it works. There was a couple of plug-in numbers that I couldn't understand where they come from, but they were manually put in. And if you wanted to, we could sit down and figure it out. And believe it or not, you can just plug in some numbers and the spreadsheet works fantastic.
Thanks. Yes.
And I do it anytime if you want.
Hi, Chapin Kaner. I don't live in any development, and I just have a clarification question because I've been trying to understand something, and James Street will help with this. Since the people with expired permits, the state won't renew the permit. It's not that they did something bad. And since those 18 were identified, I believe some more permits have expired, and the state is not renewing them. Is that true? James, can you answer that?
To my knowledge, no other permits have expired in the Allen Brook watershed in that timeframe. If other permits have expired outside of the Allen Brook watershed, it's possible. Again, it's a relationship between the permit holder and the state, but the reason it's a bigger issue with Allen Brook is because it's impaired, so it's not as easy to just get a renewal.
So you and I looked at one that expired in March of this year, and the information said there was like a temporary renewal, not a 5-year renewal. And I'm just trying to understand if there are communities that will tomorrow be facing the same issue these 18 have been facing, And if in the difficult regulatory and environment we're in, the very reasons James gives why we shouldn't take on this responsibility, are we in a sense throwing those communities under the bus to deal with this next year and the year after the year after? And as difficult as it is to think about the long-range plan, the sort of collective bargaining that we as a town can do is probably valuable. And I'm not advocating for a position, I'm just saying that's something to be figured in with it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Excellent point.
So let's try to wrap up our thoughts on this tonight and see if we need some more information. If so, what do we need, and so we can go forward.
I would ask at a minimum that we get the numbers drawn up with refined maintenance costs.
If I may, the maintenance costs we have are a collaboration of both quotes that town staff has gotten and also working directly with the South Burlington stormwater professionals over there. We said, how do you do this? What are your estimates with regards to inspections, dredgings, et cetera? And those assumptions that South Burlington helped shape Williston estimates were also supported by Hoyle and Tanner. In regards to Jennifer's statement in the discussion we had earlier, if we're estimating that annual maintenance is $8,000 a year per pond, it could be 6, it could be 10, it could be a number of different things on a whole sliding scale, but these things will change proportionally. And again, the best effort of town staff to provide an estimate that won't, leave us out there to dry if we're not getting this 100% correct. But I do urge that we have crunched a lot of these numbers, and going back to rerunning this will involve getting back to Hoyle and Tanner and having them do another set of analyses.
So the question is, does the board wish to have that kind of information done?
I mean, I'm not going to object, I'm sure. I would like to vote, I'd like to, if we could, settle this sooner than later, but if folks think it will help, then sure.
Well, it just, if we're going to be opposed to larger burdens, and those larger burdens on some of the farms and other properties have multiple ERU costs, if we can figure out that the burden is lower, it might make different options more palatable. So, and to be honest, I'd like to also revisit the financial analysis done, so, because I'm still unsatisfied on the ERU cost, I guess. I'm still confused as to why we have such a large bump on the ERU cost. If we don't take over if we don't do any major improvements in the second half. So if there's no upgrade or...
I'm sorry to interrupt, but is your question the bump from year 10 to year 20?
Right, right, yep.
Oh, okay. Because there is a 15-year and a 20-year four-bay dredge, and
Right.
then there's a 20-year, what it's called, but it was in there, a main pond dredge at year 20.
So that upgrade was there, that major...
Main pond dredge, yes, in my assumptions,
20.
for all of these options, they're in four-bay dredge in year 15 and 20 will be captured in the 20-year rate. The main pond dredge will be captured in the 20-year rate.
Mm-hmm.
So that is, but I'm happy to share the analysis with you.
Okay. So that's the reason you think for the doubling of the ERU cost, essentially, for options 3 and 4. Okay.
So gentleman up there had a question or comment?
Yeah, I just don't have that report in front of me, so I was kind of curious about the accrual for those big expenses. Are they happening annually, or does it just kind of all drop in year 15 and year 20?
What I did is a very simple analysis of saying at year 5, this is This is the expense that Hoyle and Tanner said was going to happen in year 5, so that's where I added that expense in. At year 10, this expense was added in. At year 20, we had the 15-year, the 20-year, and then the 20-year main pond.
So in theory, the first 9 years wouldn't capture the expense that's gonna drop in on the 10th year? Is that right? Just because if I'm a homeowner and I have to repaint my house, I would accrue for that annually and try to think about budgeting for that. So instead of hiding it as an expense that comes up in 10 years.
Oh, absolutely. There would be, I mean, we would have to do a budget for this every year and a 5-year capital plan or 6-year capital plan for this every year to take into account all of these expenses. And that's why there might be arguments that they're too high. They're actually probably too low in some cases if we're not taking into account those major upgrades.
Sandy?
Yes, Sandy Miller. The financial analysis took into consideration loans to the neighborhoods under the loan program that was approved?
I don't believe that was in
No.
Hoyle and Tanner's analysis, no.
Was it in yours?
No.
That's separate.
So it didn't take into consideration the cash flow concept of loaning the money to the neighborhoods, and therefore it didn't take into account repayment either?
It did not, no.
Heard a suggestion from Teresa about information request, and I didn't hear a consensus on that.
I'm good with it.
I don't think it's going to change my mind, but I don't want to stifle data coming in either. So, but the question I guess I'd have before I take a firm position on whether we get more information is, what's the agenda look like at the next meeting, and can we get this information?
First of all, we're not going to have a full board next meeting. Second of all, the main topic is review of town plan. And we have a whole bunch of different rates to set. Tax rate, sewer rate.
When is a likely date for taking this issue up again?
Well, it depends. If you schedule a special meeting, then it's depending on the availability of board members. If it's a regular meeting, the next meeting after the June meeting would be sometime in July.
Let me ask you another question. That we've decided on the grant policy, which I think was reasonably time sensitive. Is that right?
Yes.
And we've done that.
Yes.
I would almost say the decision of these options is perhaps even more time sensitive. These options will actually drive exactly how we approach these grants. For instance, grants require a match. The grants we're applying for require 50% match from the town. So is that 50% match from the neighborhood solely? Is the town contributing based on some sort of percentage that is put forth in the options? And then just looking at our budget and our capital savings, what do we have available for these grants if we're matching, if we're not matching?
And if we have loans to give out, how much we would have available for loans, we don't know at this point.
The next round of grants is July 5th, right?
Right, we have to submit a number of grants in early July, and the grant we applied for, we should find out about in mid-June whether or not we can take the next step, in which case that would be, the town staff sent out a preliminary email to HOA saying, we're not asking for it yet, but we might ask for this information soon, and the reason we sort of worded it like that is because whatever decisions made with regards to these options will influence our decision-making as staff as to how to approach the grants in general, and the budget of the stormwater program.
Is there any way we could, I don't think we're going to need extensive deliberation with the new information. It's either going to change minds or not. How could we squeeze in 20 minutes on this at the next meeting?
Again, you're not going to have a full board, remember that. So that's kind of a major factor.
I'm going to be gone, so there'd be presumably 4 here.
We're also assuming we can get the consultants to get us information in that sort of quick turnaround. That was an issue in this last round of utilizing the consultants.
So Chris, you had a comment?
I have a report from Royal Tanner. I'd like to read something. Bear with me, I'm not a very good reader. In general, homeowners associations members typically have little or no experience in stormwater treatment, operation, maintenance, and capital improvements. In contrast, town and stormwater fund have dedicated staff, expertise in stormwater treatment, operation, maintenance, and capital improvements. With that said, I have to know and understand why we need to go with Royal Tanner for this analysis. And I would like to know who you consulted, James, for contractors when, for the prices, for the costs for grading.
Yeah, and I can answer I don't want to get into the nuances of that right now.
No, but can you address that individually?
Yeah, we can say who we got those quotes from, that's not a problem. They were from ECI, Dirt Tech, and
VTUMS.
VTUMS. 3 contractors.
I work for ECI.
I know who you work for, Chris, and I'm getting, it's one thing here, and I'm not doubting Chris has been doing this for 30-some years, but we aren't new at this either. So to keep questioning our numbers and saying that, you want us to give you new numbers, is that numbers you want Chris to give us to give you? I mean, I'm not sure where you want these numbers to come from.
The thing is, your numbers haven't changed. I mean, they've been the same old numbers. I mean, come on, 16 hours for the bush hogging, 22 times a year for inspections. I mean, we're
getting down to how the Public Works Department is run here. And that's exactly what's happening. So if that's the challenge, or you want me to sit here and defend that department, I will do that. But I don't like being questioned all the time here on what happens or doesn't happen, or whether we go out and look at catch basins or not before a storm or after a storm, because we do. The guys drive around to make sure things aren't blocked and plugged. So, is that what's happening?
Can I ask?
Okay.
The policy as it is, I mean, the policy exists right now. We have a policy in place right now. Can you go forward and apply for those grants, given how the policy is right now? And would it disqualify us? I know it's a tough question to ask and answer, but would changing the policy disqualify us from the grants?
It wouldn't disqualify us. It would make it difficult for me to plan. We'd need to take sort of a step back. Again, there's 50% match required for these grants, and a lot of these grants are getting up there in cash flow. So we would essentially need to review our budget. We would need to review our rate. We'd need to look at when our rate would increase, and we'd need to sort of rethink all that before committing ourselves to these grants that require match. So nothing's impossible. We will make what decision the select board makes happen. It will just take more work if we choose a different option.
Well, as loath as I am to throw the idea out, I'm wondering if we could have a special half-hour meeting to be scheduled as quickly as possible, dependent on when we think we can get the information that Terry wants. In addition, how responsive is Hoyle and Tanner?
They're very responsive. I'm still unclear exactly what additional information we need, exactly how we're going to structure that. A lot of things have been said today with regards to additional information that we could perhaps repackage this as.
A specific issue.
I made a specific request that we provided some additional quotes from a person who does this as a job. And my impression was that the numbers you came up with, James, were the same numbers you came up with an academic paper a year ago. That was my impression from what I saw. So we didn't see where those numbers came from otherwise. There was no other information provided on how those things came about.
All due respect, that has been provided to you. detailed analyses and discussion on how the hours were anticipated for inspections, where these quotes came from have been provided, and if the additional information had been desired at any point, I'd be happy to give it to you. But yes, that information has been shared in one way, shape, or form.
Is it in the, where is it?
I'd want to get back to you probably in more detail.
Because I remember asking for the scope for the analysis, and I remember being told that the scope was,
Well, now we're switching gears. The scope is slightly different than how we estimated our maintenance costs, which was a lot of back and forth, individually calling South Burlington and working on past quotes that we've gotten. And yes, it has been influenced by an academic research paper. That is true as well. But it's been a long-term process where we've looked into and contacted many sources.
okay. I didn't see it as part of this package, though, so.
Wasn't part of tonight's package, that's correct.
Or the package on the 9th. I didn't see it on the package on the 9th.
It was before that, I believe.
Well, then I don't, yeah, so it wasn't really provided for the 9th, so if you have it, that would be great to see if it's, but I think we still need a consensus on whether we're going to look at the alternative maintenance costs.
Yes, but.
And you can look at it as a window. I mean, you could look at it as here's a bounding box of costs, although I think some of the higher end costs are maybe a little unreasonable, but.
So your request then is to have someone who does this as a job to provide us information? Now, did you have somebody in mind for that?
Chris provided the town those quotes. I mean, you guys can decide whether you want to use those or.
Those quotes are based on today's values. So we're looking at numbers over a 20-year period, so something else has to be done with those numbers beyond just saying, okay, these are, today I can buy it for this, but 10 years from now.
Absolutely right. So whatever that $10,000 4-bay charge, that it would scale the same though. They would scale, the $10,000 future value would scale the same way as a $4,000, it would scale with whatever cost of living or whatever cost of money increases over time or inflation over time apply to those numbers. They would both scale. It would be no different. But if that's a factor, if it's not a factor in the decision of the majority of the board, then it would be a waste of time to go do it, right? If it wouldn't sway, if the magnitude of the numbers wouldn't sway the decision, then it's not a meaningful thing to do. I'm still on the point of thinking that this is a benefit to homeowners in the entirety for the town. So we're taking care of a problem that has been placed upon us by the federal government and these different Clean Water Acts, which benefit everybody. The lake benefits everybody, and we're burdening a certain small subset of the community, or actually a fairly large subset of the community, disproportionately. And I'm still in that mindset that it's a public thing, and we should share that burden. And just like in the future, if we have to put a stormwater pond on Route whatever in the town as a result of town road runoff, because that's a future EPA need, then we would all pay into that the same way. So I'm still of that mindset, and I also would like to see us, Chris's point on homeowners not being experienced or capable in maintaining stormwater ponds is a good point, not just because of the financial point, but because homeowners do a lousy job of that kind of work, and having the town take care of that as a utility, to me, makes a lot of sense, and that is taking care of the non-expired permits as well. It's probably the best insurance that they will be taken care of by capable and competent staff like we have. So, and it does protect, like I think Chapin said, that if we have some new policy that comes down the chute that affects these other neighborhoods, we're allowing them to be carrying the burden for the town. So that's where I'm stuck. So if that doesn't change anybody else's perspective or the majority, then we shouldn't redo the estimates because it would be, right? I mean, I don't want to waste your time, so.
Oh,
So I'm still looking for whether or not we have consensus.
Terry, I think you have valid points. I weigh things differently.
Yeah, I understand, but, no. Yeah, and for me, it's not $20 a year for me for the roads versus not the roads, and it'd be a few more dollars if we're kind of spreading that cost to take care of the other neighborhoods, right? $20 a year in year 20 when we have, I don't know how much taxes you pay, but, in the
Yep, I understand.
double figures, it's not a lot when you talk about taking care of the lakes, taking care of clean water and benefiting everybody, so.
I agree.
So I hear at least 3 people in favor, no, 2 people in favor.
I don't think it's going to change my mind.
Pardon me?
It's not going to change how I weigh things.
Okay. So I'm not sure where we're at as far as consensus on this.
On
I'm
additional
not
data.
inclined to get more numbers.
So I would not be in favor either, so that one, we will not be doing that. And Sandy, any solution to our problem?
I don't know if it's a solution to the problem, it's apropos of something Ted asked about, if the current policy is in place or is it modified. This creates complications for staff. Previously, staff had indicated at previous meetings that it was going to attempt to maximize the amount of grants it was applying for, and it was going to work with the neighborhood stormwater coordinators. Is that still going to happen?
An email was sent out by James recently, kind of setting the table, saying, yes, we need to get together soon. We can't start that process until we get some more information, and the decisions tonight affect part of that.
Okay, I guess so. As a follow-up on that, thank you. I don't really understand how that decision affects what grants we apply for at all. If there's a cash flow issue, we don't know that because you already said you had enough money to loan to neighborhoods without. So if it was a loan to the neighborhood or being paid for by the stormwater fund, it's the same amount of money. And if there is a cash flow problem with the stormwater fund, there's always the possibility of an interfund loan from the general fund. I'm sure that the town's done that before. They're legal and they work very, very easily. So I don't really understand how a decision on the current path or alternative would affect anything the town would apply for.
We will make whatever decision you make work with regards to the grants. This decision is much larger than grants.
Chapin?
And I'm repeating this just because I said this at town meeting too, and so I'll just say if no one in the room can say, is the state renewing permits currently, and how many will be coming up in the next 3 years, that's information I would want to know in making a decision between these options if I were sitting in your chair.
So the question still is before us as to whether or not we want to keep the policy as it is or do a different policy based on some option. I'm not sure where we're at as far as making that decision tonight.
I would not be in favor of rescinding the policy.
Neither would I be. If we want to investigate other options and continue to do that, I think that's an option that we can do. But I would not like to rescind what we have in place right now.
Oh, I see. So I think the current policy is inequitable. I mean, I don't have any problem leaving it in place until we find something new, but I guess I wasn't clear on what the next step would be.
Well, I think
if we don't rescind the old policy tonight.
I heard support for the all-in option tonight, looking at the the neighborhoods that do not have expired permits, and I'm not sure where we're at with that at this point, but I've heard some support for looking at that anyway.
Well, I still feel strongly that, to me, it's that equity issue, but I'm not sure I support option 3 as it's currently described, which has the 60-40 split on the improvement cost. So, I'm not ready to make a motion to modify the policy.
Is there information that we need in order to look at that?
So one of the thoughts is that if you break down the option cost increases by their constituent pieces, that is, you have kind of 4 different things that are moving here. You have maintenance of expired permits, maintenance of the non-expired permits, right? Those are 2 different pieces. Mm-hmm. Then you have the cost of upgrading the current stormwater ponds, or and if you will, the entire cost, and then you have the 60-40 split cost. And the town would just be looking at, from a constituent piece, just the piece that the town would share across the ERUs, right? So if you broke those, if you came up with ERU cost increases for year 5, 10, 20, for each of those constituent pieces, then we can add, and we could kind of create our own matrix of options, if you will. We could come up with more options that are listed here. In the Hoyle-Tanner report, I was disappointed that none of the options that we actually had been talking about for the last year were included. So an option, for instance, a simple option that said, the current policy, take the town roads over. Just take the town. That wasn't an option in the report. That simple one. Or the all-in option, which came up at town meeting day, which was, and it's not the same as the all-in option that's listed. All-in would be the town basically takes over upgrades and maintenance of everything, right? Basically make it go away. And that could be, and that wasn't followed up on, I think, on your work either, Jennifer. But it was, if you could dissect it out of Hoyle-Tanner's work, but it wasn't listed as one of the options. So that's a way to look at it anyway.
All-in option for me, because I'm not sure I understand.
Well, the all-in option, I think, is the one that came up at town meeting day is the town would take over all the upgrade costs, so 100% of the upgrade cost of the expired permits, and take over maintenance of all of the stormwater ponds. A couple of people on town meeting day brought that particular option up, and it's basically, that says, we're going to create a town stormwater utility that actually takes care of all of the town stormwater problem. That was a request. I don't think that's in any of the options.
It is by default, the first column, where they calculate the entire program cost. So the exact option you're putting forward, the numbers are there. As a matter of fact, even the ERUs are there. So it actually was included. Perhaps the nomenclature could have been improved, but it was there.
I'm just saying that you could come up with the 5, 10, 20 year ERU increases based on that particular total cost option, if you will. And it's just a way to look at, you had a question, what if we did this? Well, you could look at it in that way without having to go back to the well 40 times to ask for different options, right? Because there are only a few pieces I think we're talking about, but.
And I guess that information won't hurt, and I can give you clarity in terms of what it is I would like for how to cost out, what I'm going to call the modified all-in option. which is the 100%, 0% split. But I think the question also comes down to is, and that information is good information, but is it going to change people's minds on the select board? And it sounds to me like 3 select board members feel the policy is appropriate and good and should stay the way it is. I have a desire for it, you have a desire for it. We still have the option of having that information and taking action on it later. I guess we're beating something.
Yeah, I don't know
I'm not
how
sure
we.
what else we can do.
Right, so I guess the only person, I think Ted and Joy have maybe made themselves clear. I don't know if Terry's made himself clear. If I only heard that Terry didn't want to rescind the policy today, but I don't know if Terry thinks that there's any policy option that would be better than what we're doing today.
I don't know if there's anything better, but I'd like to see the information that you're asking for to make a decision.
Okay.
Well, that's 3 people then.
Okay,
That's 3 of us.
Get the information.
So is it understood by staff then what we're looking for?
I think that analysis that you're looking for is very easy to do.
Okay, I think so too.
For percentages. When you get into the present worth value of all these different costs, I think that's where it gets a little bit beyond my skill set. If you're looking at percentages and saying like, okay, well, if we say we're going to pay 50% of this, and then we can take those numbers and split them in half and figure out and say percentages. And so at the bottom, you would have something similar to what Rick shared with you of saying the stormwater fund will pick up 91% of the cost, and expired permit holders will pick up 9% of the cost.
And for the table that would be the most helpful for me, and I think it's a great table, is labeled ratepayers estimated. And how difficult would it be to modify that table to include a modified, or maybe modifications to option 3, the all-in?
We would actually need to go back to the consultant. Again, they ran present worth analyses that we can't duplicate. That would be, sending them another scope of work and renegotiating with them on current continued efforts.
One thing I will say, and I can do homework on my own, I pretty much have everything I think I need in the Hoyle-Tanner report. I just have to figure out how to look at those numbers and recalculate what they put together. I mean, for instance, one number where it says 40%, that becomes 0. One number where it's 60%, that becomes 100%. And I can go through and do those. And
that's what we did when we were looking at the percentages that Rick shared with you, and we looked at, and we took those numbers, and that's where we came up with, wow, these are all, percentages are similar, and they go up and down similarly. If you say, oh, okay, it's not going to cost $4.6 million to do all these upgrades. It's actually going to cost $2.5 million. You can change that and see how that percentage carries across to the different options. And you can see that the options all change in a similar way. But as far as adding in new options, you could play with it however you wanted.
And I think I ran some numbers. I think there's like 50 different potential options. You added all the different permutations together, and so it's hard for us to try to interpret what you have in your minds.
But what you're asking for specifically is if the town took over ongoing future maintenance renovations for all the permits, all the
permits,
residential
expired
permits.
and valid.
So that's one thing.
Yeah.
And upgrades?
It would be, well, the upgrades, the improvements, what are called improvement, would be 100% homeowner association, 0% stormwater fund.
That is the option you have. That's
No, the option we have is 40% stormwater, 60%.
No, the first column in the Hoyle-Tanner report is the total program costs. And so
Right.
that's exactly what you just said.
No, because that would mean that it would be 100% stormwater fund when it would be 0% stormwater fund for the improvement cost.
Oh, for the, oh, I'm sorry.
You see what I'm saying?
Yes,
Yes.
okay,
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
You guys clear on what you're supposed to get?
So
I
for the-
heard 2 additional options.
Maybe just one, right?
Well, Jeff had one, and Terry has one.
Oh, okay.
So you're looking for just a single option, and that is?
That's the one I'm interested in understanding what the numbers are.
And Jeff, we can estimate that fairly closely.
Yeah.
Option 3 is what you're saying, but instead of, we're just going to switch the improvement costs, which means we have $700,000 more into the neighborhood section. So what we're talking about is you're shifting $700,000 out of 11.5 million. So kind of my answer to you is certainly it'll change the percentages, but not a lot at that point. So you can sort of use option 3 as an indicator and say, well, okay, stormwater fund is a few percentage points less and the expired permits are a couple few percentage points more, but you can kind of do that mental math with what we have here.
And that's what I felt I could come pretty close.
And that piece we could do, when we get into changing these base numbers that he's building everything off, that's
Yeah.
where.
I'm not asking that.
So are we all clear as to what we're asking for?
Okay, well,
So you're only interested in one different option?
no, well, that's the one, I'm happy to look at other information too. And you just said a key thing. You said it won't change the numbers much, and that's an important aspect of that.
We're kind of beating on the number thing here, and I wonder if the numbers, is it the numbers? Is it the numbers we're disagreeing with as a board, the burden of the additional ERU cost? Or is it philosophically you don't feel like, I'm trying to figure out why, I'm trying to understand philosophically why different board members are in the place they're in, so,
I think it's
so
a discussion.
if the numbers change by, for instance, $3, does it change anybody's mindset? Or,
It may not, but I think it's a discussion for another night when we have the information in front of us. So if we're through with that topic for tonight, we can move on to the manager's report.
It's 10 minutes or so.
Well, I'll give a quick update on my written report, and I have some things in addition to my written report to report on. On the police chief recruitment process, the interviews have been set up. We have 7 individuals that will be interviewing the upcoming round, and everyone that was invited for an interview has agreed. So no one's dropped out of the running so far. And we ended up with over 75. I think it was actually more than 75. A couple came in late, but anyway. So that process is continuing to move along. On another matter, Industrial Avenue Bridge, that work is just about completed. The weather hasn't been cooperative the last couple days, or at least today anyway. That project is running over budget. There are some unforeseen issues, but, well, I shouldn't say over budget. It's within the amount we have available, but it was over the original estimate because some unforeseen conditions were encountered. Things were worse than they had appeared on the surface, so that boosted the price somewhat. But as I said, it is within the amount of money that we do have available. While on the topic of projects that are underway and problems developing, the town hall work on the bell tower, shall we call it, it ran into some problems. When you start pulling things off, we find that there's a fair amount of carpenter ant damage, which was partly because some moisture at some point got in there, and maybe the moisture problem got fixed, but it allowed the carpenter ants to get a stronghold, and so there's a lot of damage. So we're looking at, we have two parts to it, and the money was supposed to cover the repair of both parts. The lower part, which is the base, and then the upper part. If we take the money we're going to spend on the lower part and put it all towards the upper part, we got 100% of it covered. But I've asked, I want to get a quote on doing the whole thing, even though it may be over budget, because everything's mobilized, they got all the scaffolding up, and in my opinion, we should just get it all fixed. So we'll be working on that. We received some good news today. Actually, we had a forewarning of it, but I sent along a news release concerning the grant. We are very, very fortunate. We're one of 7 communities across the country that received this money, and we received the largest amount, along with one other community, I think, also had a sizable amount, which I found, there are 2 others that had the same amount. I found interesting that almost all these communities except for 2 were in New England, so I don't know what that was about. But in any case, this is one large piece of funding, and there's others that are being pursued for this. And of course, we're just going to be getting started soon with our study committee, but this was important. And one of the reasons why we pushed for this now was because our concerns about the money not being available a year from now. And I think it was wise because we got the grant. It's for the community forest, the Catamount Community Forest.
Along that same point, since you brought up the community forest, did we ever get, was an appraisal ever done on the property? That was one of the things that was going to be done, so we understood what...
Yeah, that's a normal part of the process. I don't know if that's been done yet, but that...
Don't some of the grants require it? Or
Yes, yeah, well, we would require it. Anytime there's town money involved, we would need to get an appraisal. The annual 4th of July parade is coming up. This year, it's going to be on July 4th.
Wow.
Well, there are some years it isn't, when it falls on a Sunday in particular. Todd Goodwin, our recreation director, has put out a request for judges to serve on the parade. And we have normally 1 member of the select board, so I'm looking for a volunteer. Oh, Joy is, okay, it's good. So unless...
I still get asked to judge in Richmond, oddly enough, which I say no to now.
Okay, good. We'll start on the bridge. And that's all I had for this evening.
Good, thank you. Is there any other business that we need to talk about tonight?
So, does anybody want to spend a few more minutes talking about, or can't we talk about stormwater? Because frankly, I want to get over this too. I want to get beyond, and I can't, when I'm trying, in the number thing, it seems like it's kind of a rat hole, right? We can get one set of estimates or another set. I feel, and I ask Chris sincerely, he's not lowballing the numbers. He's putting his reputation behind him, so he feels like the numbers are correct. But I don't think, from what I'm hearing, it's not necessarily those numbers that are, Ted, I think it doesn't, that's independent, right? And Joy, I'm not sure, and Terry, I'm not sure either. I'm parked in a different place. I feel like it's a public good. It's you pay a utility fee, everybody should get some utility. And you're either getting clean water or you're getting, the maintenance of the thing that's providing clean water. So I know others don't feel that way, but because I feel kind of like we're swirling and we're not converging on a solution, just redoing the numbers, and that's what I'm afraid of.
So let me reiterate what I said before. I think that's a topic for another evening to talk about when we have a chance to go back and think about what we heard tonight from the conversations that we had. Yeah. So we'll have a brief conversation about this at some other point.
Okay. All right. That's fair.
So okay. Is there any other business to talk about tonight? If not, then we are adjourned.
Thanks. Sorry, I was actually hoping as well, either one way or the other. I wanted to just have it,